The German involvement with the subject of space travel. Now, if you know anything about history, I'm sure most of you do, Hitler was fascinated with the subject of space. He had hundreds of scientists working on really highly sensitive projects for rocket technology and even space travel. And some of the most hideous experiments that were being conducted at concentration camps by Hitler and the Third Reich involved humans and what would happen to a human being if they were subjected to space travel. So there's a lot of things that are really sensitive that we're going to talk about today. In the beginning here, the history of the German involvement with space. The World War II experiments with human beings, how they would act, how would they react, or how would their body function in space travel. Well, of course, back in the 40s and the 30s, we didn't know much about it. We didn't know much about anti-gravity, gravity or anti-gravity. So they actually built in these concentration camps experiments like spinning a human being around for an hour as if they were going into orbit, and then determine what happened to their bodies. Hideous experiments trying to perfect some way of space travel. And then comes Wernher von Braun. He was the father of their space program, or their experiments, and he's also the father of our rocket program in the United States. The V-3 rocket, well, if you all know, the V-3 wasn't a rocket, it was a railgun, but we interpreted it as being a rocket back in World War II. The actual rocket was the HS-239. That was the actual rocket that the German government was experimenting with back in those days. The 10-mile incident. Hitler told von Braun and the other scientists working on rocket technology that he wanted a rocket that would go 10 miles into space, okay? 10 miles into space. And so you figure that's going to be over 50,000 feet. And so they never perfected that. But every time the technical wizards within the Nazi Party briefed Hitler, the first question was, did we perfect some kind of airplane that could go 10 miles into space? Well, they couldn't. A lot of problems with that. Post-World War II Germany. Operation Paperclip, which was a highly classified program in those days, rounded up and brought to the United States some 1,600 German scientists, technicians, and other people associated with their rocket program. They sent them to a number of different locations, ending up down in New Mexico at White Sands. And their mission was to develop a rocket program for the United States. That worked well for us, but there were a lot of problems keeping them secret. Now you got to understand that 1,600 of these scientists came from the Third Reich, enemy of the United States, to the United States. Some of these scientists, engineers, were in those concentration camps performing these horrible experiments. Now, alongside this, you got to remember we had the Soviet Union, who was our ally during the war and the enemy against Germany. But the Soviets knew these scientists existed, and they wanted their technology and their know-how and their brain power just as much as we wanted them. So there was a lot of intelligence activities to prevent anyone from knowing paperclip existed, and that these scientists were in the United States, and they were working on secret programs for the United States government. So there was intelligence operations going on, counterintelligence going on back and forth between the United States and Russia, because eventually Russia knew where they went. Some families of these scientists and technicians were left in Germany. They either didn't want to go or they weren't cleared by the US Army to bring them over. So eventually the Russians were able to contact some relatives and find out that their loved ones or these scientists were in the United States. In 1947, the US Army engineers in Berlin were digging into the rubbles around Nazi headquarters in Berlin, and they found these booklets, huge pamphlets and booklets that were classified by German standards, but pertained to this technology. When these manuals, all in German of course, were found, they immediately were turned over to US intelligence, US Army intelligence, eventually made their way back to the United States, and now we have manuals to operate under, because the 1,600 scientists and technicians that were brought over to the United States didn't have access to this. Now, in 1947, they had the ability to look at the manuals that they had created regarding space travel and rocket technology. What amazed US scientists was how detailed these manuals were, as if they had already experimented with enough to understand escape velocity when a rocket has to defy gravity to get out of our atmosphere. They had calculations for that. But some of the other things they didn't know about was what was inside these rockets that they were testing, and how to compensate for the equipment. I was talking last night, my friend Mike Bear, and we were talking about this, and he brought up some things that he knew about Wernher von Braun regarding the mistakes that they did in their calculations of not compensating for gyros and other things inside this rocket when it's launched. But eventually, they overcome all that. Let's talk about the Roswell incident in 1947. If you don't already know about it, I'm sure you probably have heard enough about it. But let's just briefly talk about it. An actual US government, these are facts by the government. I myself, and I know of at least 124 other intelligence officers that were briefed into this program. 63 of them are still alive today. Some of them already came out and talked about it, the same thing I'm talking about. So there was a craft crashed in the deserts of New Mexico in 1947. One crashed near Corona, New Mexico. The actual craft crashed near Corona, which is north of Roswell. And there was another debris field. Now this is a McBrazel Ranch debris field that people talk about that was farther south. The debris field was the antenna off the craft that crashed near Corona, New Mexico. The craft that crashed near Corona, New Mexico was found by an archaeological team from the University of New Mexico. Stan Friedman wrote a large amount of information about that. He spoke to the actual professor that led that team. Of course, all these people are passed away now. Stan talked to him. Stan documented that information along with some other researchers, such as Bill Moore, William Moore, and others. So we know that this happened. And how do we know? How do I know? Is because I was briefed into a program where we saw the recovery film, the old Army recovery film, briefed on the fact that it happened. What a lot of people don't realize is there was a second craft that crashed during that same time period. But that craft crashed in western New Mexico near Pelona Peak, a very remote area of New Mexico. In 1949 is when that craft was found. It's found by a rancher taking his cattle up to a new grazing place and found it. Now, this is really remote in New Mexico. It took him 10 days to be able to report this to the local sheriff, and eventually the local sheriff, over a period of 3 weeks, contacted the Army. They came down and recovered it. Well, we already had the 47 craft. 1949, we found this other craft, identical same craft. Absolutely identical same craft, same ETs aboard, but they were all obviously dead and their bodies were decayed over a period of time. So now we got 2 crafts. This is in the late 40s, we have 2 crafts. The first craft crashed, Corona, we have a live ET. We found a live ET. 5 dead bodies, 1 live one. They named him Eba. The intelligence community figured this name out because they considered it an extraterrestrial biological entity, so they named it Eba. He lived in captivity at Los Alamos for 5 years. He died in 1952. But during that time period, he told us about his technology. But you got to understand, they're thousands of years more advanced in technology than we are. So we couldn't understand everything that alien was telling us. Although he was showing us things, he was showing us items out of his craft, which we're going to talk about, and he tried to provide us with some of their science. The mistakes we were making back in those days, as far as technologies and understanding alien technologies, we were trying to compare our technology, our science, our math, with an extraterrestrial technology or science. Well, they're thousands of years more advanced. They have different math systems. Now, generally speaking, and I used to teach math, generally speaking, math, algebra, trigonometry, all those wonderful courses you just love to take, or calculus, we should be the same. Well, the solutions could be the same, but the application of the problem and the application of solving that solution could be different. Now, years later, scientists realized this. One of the top scientists that wrote about this was my former boss, Dr. Hal Puthoff, the Institute for Advanced Studies. He goes, let's stop thinking about trying to learn or to compare our technology with theirs. Let's learn their technology, or try to. Now, we had one in captivity, and he was teaching us. We had brilliant scientists out of Los Alamos, one of the top laboratories, probably the only top laboratories back in the 40s and early 50s that existed. And he was teaching them. We recovered debris from these spacecrafts. Now, we didn't know what to do with it. If we found a piece of plexiglass, we thought it was a window. The scientists looked at it and said, that's a window off the spacecraft. Lo and behold, that's an energy device. We found a tube with markings on it. It took a number of years before we could actually figure out what that was. It was a form of a translator, a universal translator. But these things weren't given to eBay. One of the mistakes we made was when we captured this extraterrestrial, we put him in captivity. We isolated him. It was a male. And we didn't let him have contact with anything inside that craft, fearing that something might be a weapon or something he could get would harm himself. For several years, we didn't allow him, well, we had recovered the items, but we didn't allow him to have access to it. Eventually, smarter people woke up and said, listen, let's bring these things in, set them down on the table, and try to ask him what these were. And we eventually did that. materials were all, excuse me, I have allergies. I wonder why in this wonderful tropical climate here in UK. Now remember, they're at Los Alamos, so all these items are contained in Los Alamos. Let's talk about some projects regarding the recovered items from the alien craft. We have Project Starbeam, Project Night Trace, Snowbird, Amber Red, and Tango Rose. These are all official United States intelligence and government projects that we started to try to analyze the debris found, and not just the Corona crash, but the Paloma Peak crash of the craft that we found in 1949. But as I said earlier, they're identical crafts. They come from the same technology. Starbeam. Starbeam examined communications technology found in the Eben craft. And some of this is really going to fascinate you. It fascinated me. I'm not a scientist. But this particular device they found, eventually, Eba showed us how to use it. Eba, his plan was to communicate with his home planet in the Zeta Reticuli star group and send a message so his people could come and rescue him and pick up the bodies. I mean, that's what we would do if we were stranded. We want to get back to our home planet. Eventually, he showed us how this thing operated. Unfortunately, he passed away before he really gave us all the nuts and bolts and explained exactly how it worked. But we have smart scientists out there. We have people within communications companies in the 50s that kind of figured out how this thing worked. The information he gave to us and the information he wanted to send back, we knew. So we actually did this. We actually, an Air Force communications unit out of in New Mexico, actually developed a system based on what he told us to send a beam with this device. Now, it's going to be difficult for you to understand this because I didn't understand it and even believe it. Now, his planet is in a Zeta Reticuli star group. Now, if you remember back to the Betty Hill case in 1961 in New Hampshire, they were abducted by ETs. Betty actually was shown a star chart. She remembered it and drew it. Scientists, astronomers saw it and figured out, oh, that's the Zeta Reticuli star group. 38 light years away, approximately 38 light years away. That's where Eba came from. So we send a signal to the planet. Now, speed of light, it would take 38 years to get there and 38 years to get back, right? Yeah. Well, it took 9 months for a signal to come back to Earth in a receiving station. Now, this is highly classified back then. We didn't know how that worked. We didn't know how can you send something faster than the speed of light. Well, today, right now, 2022, we have the technology to do that. We do, believe it or not. Motorola spent billions of dollars. Motorola, everybody should know, they make radios and communications. They're experimenting with technology that can do that. I don't know how it works, and I'm not going to go into details on it, but today we could do it. We couldn't do it back then, but the technology that Eba gave us was able to do that. We also examined propulsion technology off the Eben craft, both crafts. We knew it had a propulsion system. Obviously, it flew from one place to another. We got here. We didn't know how it worked. It was so advanced. The scientists just tried everything possible trying to understand this. They excuse me. They examined the environmental technology. Now, The interior of this craft was somewhat complex. Had a control panel. The panel had handprints where apparently the ETs placed their hands in this, these devices and controlled the aircraft. At least that's what we figured. We never allowed Iba to go to see his aircraft, which probably was a big, big, big mistake. Anyways, and there were other things in that craft that we didn't understand, but eventually did. The electronics. There wasn't any wires, knobs, buttons, switches in the craft. Well, we knew in the late 40s and early 50s, we knew how circuits worked, obviously. Crudeness. We still had vacuum tubes. I think some of you in here will know what a vacuum tube was. We didn't have we didn't have solid state electronics or advanced electronics that we would do today. Well, so we had to figure out how did their electronics work? How their circuitry worked? Well, guess what? We found out that there's such a thing as fiber optics. We didn't understand it then. We obviously understand it later. And then the environmental parts of the craft. How did they survive space travel? What happened in this craft? What happens? What kind of gravity or what kind of advanced technologies did they have inside the spacecraft that allowed them to travel all these distances and not be affected? Now, biologically, they were different than us. Their bodies were different. We knew that because we had an ET that we examined. We took the fluids from them, we x-rayed them, and all these things. Again, this is 40s and 50s technology. And the survival systems for the space travel. How did they survive from going from one place to another? Night Trace examined ET technology in relationship to our technology. This was a big mistake on our part because, as I said earlier, we were looking at alien technology and we were comparing it to our technology. We were saying, okay, here's what they have. Okay, here's what we have. What's the same? How can we make them work together? And that was a big mistake. But scientists are sometimes really stubborn. I don't know if there's any scientists in the room. I'm sure there's one or two. But you know, they're stubborn. Eventually they woke up and said, we can't do this. Snowbird endurance, how ETs can handle the zero gravity during space travel. Now, how do they do that? Well, they're different biologically than we are. They have some form of a system that when the aircraft takes off, there's some sort of a pressurization system that works inside this craft. We could never find out where that came from, but we knew it existed because we were experimenting. So they pressurized the interior of the craft in some way that would protect them. Amber Red was the first effort to duplicate the alien technology. Now, this was in the 50s and 60s. We were trying to duplicate, as we are doing today, as we speak. Tango Rose was the first communication link to ET contact, and I talked about that. Talked about exactly how that happened. We don't understand it. We didn't understand it, but it existed. Now I'm going to talk about Project Horizon. Now, I'm going to talk about it twice in two different respects. Project Horizon was first, emphasize that, first highly classified program that started in 1952. There's two parts to Horizon. It was in an effort to gain advanced technology and U.S. space travel. We gained a lot of information from EBA 1. We call it EBA 1 because guess what? There was another EBA later. But we obtained a lot of information from him regarding communications and propulsion systems and other things. And so what we did was we were able to reverse some of this. Okay, we don't know how this operates over here, but we know that's a propulsion system. So let's try to develop something similar, at least in accordance with our current technology, what it should have been in the 50s and 60s. And so we not developed scientific principles that could compare with the even technology or their science, but we were able to do some really unique things when it comes to reverse engineering. The ET spacecraft, we recovered two, as I said. We were able to utilize a fake even hand to control the flight operations of Craft 1, the one that landed in Corona. However, we could not successfully fly the craft into space, but over a period of several years, we finally perfected flight travel in a craft that we called Angel 1. We were absolutely able to fly the craft. Now, the technology and all the uniquenesses of how we did that, I'm not going to go into details on. Angel 1 was flown, the first test flight from White Sands to, you guessed it, Area 51, that area, actually the Nevada test site. Now, the Nevada test site is different from Area 51. It's all contained in the Nellis Test and Training Range, and Groom Lake is one place, Papoose Lake is another place. Nellis Test and Training Range, Nevada test site, which is now called the Nevada National Security Site, is all in one area, and also Tonopah Air Base. So this was flown up there. Now, this was in October 1958. Now, remember, this was during the age where UFOs were being seen all over. Most of the UFO sightings in the 58, 59 time frame could be contributed to Angel 1 because it was a saucer-shaped object flying not very high up because of the complexity of what we were trying to do in reverse engineering it. So people that lived in New Mexico, Arizona, and Nevada saw something and reported it through Project Blue Book, was in existence back in those days. And the scientists or top intelligence people knew that what they were actually seeing was this and not an alien craft. Let's talk about some of the agencies that contributed to space probes and the deep space program. In 1952, the National Security Agency was established. NSA was contained in a Defense Intelligence Agency Act, and it was the NSA itself belonged to the intelligence community. It was established by President Truman, and within the National Security Agency contained a Special Collection Service, SCS, Special Collection Service. You won't see that on the flow chart of the National Security Agency. You won't be able to get any information if you try to FOIA it. FOIA is the Freedom of Information Act. It's a very secretive agency within the National Security Agency. It's not a bureau. It's not a directorate. It's not a division. It's an agency. Agency within an agency. Has its own director. Everything is classified. And the information that it received, even back in those days, came from the secret portions of Project Blue Book, and even some Project Sign information that was gathered. Project Blue Book, I'm sure you all know what that is the investigation of UFOs by the United States Air Force between 1951 and 1969. Their predecessor was Sign and Grudge, Project Sign and Grudge. Basically the same thing. In 1969, a condom report was published at the request of the Air Force. Project Blue Book was closed. So the investigation, official investigation of UFOs was stopped by the Air Force. However, you're going to learn that never happened. It continued on. Okay, getting back to the Special Collections Service, anything that was out of the ordinary, classified, couldn't be explained by field investigators, was filtered to the Special Collections Service. Alien contacts, alien crafts, alien landings. NSA, back in those days, collected that. It's all filtered through Blue Book, not the Air Force. Remember, Blue Book was Air Force, and NSA was an intelligence agency. So it was filtered through the Air Force to the National Security Agency. The NSA was also responsible for collecting signals from special communication satellites placed in deep orbit. And we're going to talk about these in just a few minutes. NSA had the Beth Throne satellite that collected deep space signals and communications links that could be positively identified as ET. Now, the Ben Thorne satellite system was highly classified. The Air Force didn't know about it, but ironically, they launched it. It was supposedly a communication satellite only, and it was launched and gained orbit, and then was complexed over a period of some time. Some other things occurred, and it was launched in deep space orbit. I'm not going to go into that. Some of it's probably still highly classified. Today, NSA is a leading intelligence agency in gathering ET-related signals and photographs. Not only does the National Security Agency collect or control some satellites, they collect signal intelligence, electronic intelligence. We call it ELAN. SIGINT, signal intelligence, ELAN, electronic intelligence. And they're the top cryptographic organization in the world. They can decode about any systems or any encryption system that exists. And they do it in a very unique way. There's thousands and thousands of employees that do that. And they even, believe it or not, have been able to decrypt some signals from space. Let's talk about the National Aeronautics and Space Administration. This is a civilian agency. A civilian agency. It was created in 1958 to monitor future civilian space travel. Now remember that. NASA was planned as a civilian agency to train and control civilian space travel. Now, this is the 50s, 1958. Actually, if you look at the plan and program for NASA, it actually was written all in 1955 and 1956. But it had to go through Congress, excuse me, and then eventually made into a civilian agency. One of their missions was to establish bases on the moon and Mars. That was in their original charter. You can read it, you can Google it. To establish bases on moon and Mars. No, that's a civilian agency. They want to explore space. They want to establish outposts on the, Mars and the moon. And this kind of coincides with Project Horizon, which we will talk about here in a few minutes. NASA worked closely with civilian agencies to plan rockets and other vehicles that can travel outside our atmosphere. Now get back to our technology that we're working on in White Sands with all these Nazi scientists, including Werner von Braun. NASA, again, a civilian agency, but had military components within them. Right now, even today, they have a military branch within NASA. NASA is supposed to be a civilian agency. If you try to submit a FOIA request to NASA for something, they follow FOIA, even though they're a civilian agency, they're a government agency. They have to follow Title V in the United States Code, which is the FOIA Act. But they somehow they filter things through contractors. NASA employs a lot of different contractors to build the rockets, Boeing, and all these other US contractors. Information can be hidden with these contractors, so if you're trying to get information out of NASA, you're not going to get it. We don't know what that information is, or yeah, it's properly classified. Okay, let's talk about NRO. NRO is a National Reconnaissance Office. It was a highly classified office, organization established in 1960. The mere name of the National Reconnaissance Office was classified right up until the 1970s. No one knew it existed. Rarely highly classified. It was responsible for controlling satellites. Now you got to stop and think. You know, a lot of people are a lot smarter than me. And, wait a minute. We established this agency in 1960. We didn't have any satellites in space. We haven't even launched our first equivalent to Sputnik. The Soviets did in 1958, Sputnik 1, and then later Sputnik 2. But we didn't launch Explorer or some of these other satellites. Why did we need one? We didn't have anything out there in space. Or did we? Very few known satellites were in orbit, as I said. NRO was also responsible for monitoring all launched spacecrafts from Earth. Anything that was launched from a launch pad at Kennedy or Cape Canaveral or Vandenberg Air Force Base or even White Sands. Believe it or not, we launched rockets into space from White Sands in the 50s and 60s. So anything launched was controlled by the NRO. According to some sources, US launched 6 classified space probes in 1961 to monitor the Soviet space program. These classified space probes were controlled by NRO and the US Air Force. Now, you can get a lot of information online about this. I mean, there are people out there speculating, okay, we launched these things, Black Vault, a good place to find some really sensitive things, or FOIA information, has a couple documents pertaining to launches, these launches, but you can't find anything official, really official. Most of the information that you find online is speculative. We speculated this, somebody told us, or this, my grandfather told my father, who told my cousin, who told my brother, who told me that we launched these things in 1961. So it's not really credible until Edward Snowden popped up. Now everybody knows who Edward Snowden is. He popped into the system, worked for CIA, downloaded a bunch of classified information, and he opened what was called PIN 17. PIN, P-I-N, PIN, excuse me, PIN 17. PIN 17 was a file that contained archives of what happened in the past within NSA and CIA. PIN 17. Okay, so he thought over a period of time he started opening PIN 17 because he had thousands of files. He didn't know what they were. He couldn't sit down and look at every single file. Eventually he opened up PIN 17, and inside PIN 17 is information about spacecrafts that we launched in 1961. Now, according to these archives, a lot of these spacecrafts that we launched never made it into orbit. And I was talking to Mike about this yet last night over a couple beers, and you always, mine opens up with beers, right? And anyways, and he kind of gave me some insight into some of the things he knew about Van Braun that I didn't. and all the mistakes that were made. In the Ranger program, the first satellites that we sent up publicly, they forgot to compensate for gyros and things that I was talking about earlier. Well, they eventually launched 6 successfully out of I don't know how many that were attempts to launch these. So we were able to launch satellites back in those days. And I don't know anything more. That pin 17, of course, was immediately reclassified. And you can find one site on the internet that if you want to, my email, I'm going to show you my email. If you want to email me, I can give you that site. It's really difficult to navigate through this site because it contains literally hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of files that he had that has since been declassified, or you'll open them and most of the information is redacted. But if you know exactly what file to look for, you can see some of this information, but again, most of it is redacted. Project Horizon, I talked about that first. Project Horizon Alpha 1, a program to establish military bases on the moon. The U.S. Army had created a plan to build military bases on the moon. Now you can Google this on the internet. It's open. You can read it, download it. It was classified. It's not classified anymore. You can read about the technology, the architect, how they planned, where they were going to put all the different bases, where they're going to build the barracks or the dormitories where the soldiers could live. It was going to be a military operation, and only military personnel would live there. And it was there to protect Earth from attack. And the Manned Orbiting Laboratory, or MOL, was part of the United States Air Force Human Spacecraft Program. This coincides with Horizon. In the 1960s, the project was developed from an early U.S. Air Force concept of crew space stations as reconnaissance satellites. And the first one they built was a Boeing X-20. Some of these things they were building was later supposedly canceled. And we'll get into that in a minute. But actually one of these things, one of these advanced spacecrafts that we developed was launched. You can actually Google this and watch a launch. It doesn't say it's this particular spacecraft, but it goes into space. They perfected it, and it goes into space. And you'll see a bubble on the back of it, which, as some people will tell you, was the actual satellite that they were going to launch from it. So we have MOL and we have Horizon. Horizon was eventually canceled, supposedly, by President Eisenhower. He thought it was a great idea, but our technology had advanced enough to pursue it. The MOL, that was a United States Air Force pet project that, am I right? Okay. A pet project that they continued in the classified setting for a number of years. And of course, now we have space stations. MOL missions were launched in secret from 1965 to 1971 and masked along with the Mercury, Gemini, and Apollo space programs. Now, how do I know this? Well, in 2017, a whistleblower contacted his senator, U.S. senator. He lived in Ohio. He'd worked for NASA. He was a historian for NASA. And he knew about these things. And when NASA made a statement, a public statement, about them never having launched anything prior to a certain time period, I don't recall the exact statement NASA was making, he decided to come forth and say, they're wrong. I know what happened. So he went to his senator and said, I have all this information about what NASA really did. So he was considered a whistleblower. In the United States, we have a Whistleblower Protection Act. So he went in and talked to his senator, went to Washington, D.C., and spoke to a Senate Select Committee on Intelligence and told the story. Well, one of my, as you would call him, mates, was in that room. And he listened and figured most of what he was what he was telling the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence wasn't classified. It was history, archival stuff. Happened way back in the 60s. So why not talk about it? So he did at a UFO convention some years ago. How they did it was they used, remember, we had a Mercury, the Gemini, and Apollo space program. The Mercury was the first program that sent astronauts into space. We launched the astronauts in rockets. They were in capsules and so forth and so on. And then it came Gemini. Gemini actually orbited the Earth, docking procedures, and perfected all sorts of other things. And eventually Apollo, which, according to most people, although not everybody believes it, landed on the moon. Okay, we had several moon landings, Apollo 11, of course, all the way up to 16. But included in these launches were these secret satellites. They weren't very big, and they didn't do a whole lot, that were embedded in these spacecrafts. Now, there's a film, an old film, it's hard to watch, that shows a Gemini launch. And when the spacecraft, when the first stage separates, you got to really look at it. But something then veers off and almost gains altitude. You could see it. Of course, the camera is only pointing here, so you don't see all of it. That is, allegedly was one of these secret spacecrafts. It was launched in 65 or 66. And so that's how they mask the program. The MOL had successfully placed satellites in Earth's orbit before the space shuttle program of the 1980s. And were extremely small, but they were able to establish secret communications links to ground-based. Now, during that time period, we built 111 ground stations all over the world. Australia, which is, of course, Pine Gap. There's some Aussies in here I spoke to. Alice Springs. In the United States, in Japan, Alaska, all over. Anyways, these were stations that we could send signals to and receive signals to from these satellites. They collected also photographic intelligence and signals transmitted from space. These satellites, although they were small, they were placed in deep space orbit, a deep Earth orbit, excuse me. Eventually, we were able to do something else in sending satellites into deep space, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. Okay, Project Lunar Gleam, U.S. Air Force and NASA classified program involving Ranger 7, 8, and 9 spacecraft. These were the beginning in the 60s. We were trying to get spacecrafts into space. Now remember, look, the successful ones were 7, 8, 9. We had 1 through 6, as I was talking to Mike about, Mike was telling me, they weren't successful. They didn't make it out of it. They crashed. One particular, I believe it was a Ranger 1, and Mike can correct me if I'm wrong, missed Earth by some 38,000 miles. I mean, the moon by 38,000 miles. So there's, trajectory was a little off on that one. Ranger 7 launched July 28, 1964, was the first U.S. spacecraft to photograph the surface of the moon. 17 of the photographs were classified and have never been released by NASA. Now remember, NASA's a civilian agency, not supposed to keep a lot of secrets, but if you try to get these things, they're classified. Oh, they won't even acknowledge that it existed. Now we got Gary McKinnon. Now we know who Gary is, right? A Scottish systems analyst that pried into NASA's computer and downloaded some things. Well, lo and behold, he downloaded what the Ranger's photographs were. And although you really got to be a photo interpreter to look at these photographs and really realize what you're looking at. Because if I was to show them right here now, you'd say, I can't see anything. But if you look, you know, somebody, an expert, a photo interpreter, we call them, look at it and you say, oh my gosh, there's structures there. There's an underground facility there. So that's why NASA, and their excuse now is that, well, we got these photographs and we really didn't know what was on them and we put them away. Oh, we inadvertently destroyed them. I'm sorry. Well, they didn't. Okay. The source, and I already talked about the source reveal. One of the things that the photograph, one of the photographs, I think it was number 17, showed some kind of craft on the moon. Now, obviously, 1964, we hadn't visited the moon. The Soviets hadn't visited the moon. Chinese didn't have the technology to visit the moon. Nobody on Earth had visited the moon. So this craft that they see on the moon is alien technology. Ranger 8 launched February 20th, 1965. The sole purpose of the mission was to photograph the moon surface. 11 of the photographs were classified and never released. NASA claimed the photographs were too blurry. Oh, Gary McKinnon. Oh, they're not. And looking at them, again, you really have to know what you're looking at. That's actually one of the Rangers. That's Ranger 7. That's the actual picture of one of the crafts. Now let's jump ahead to the strategic defense initiatives. The President Reagan requested a system to defend Earth from space-based weapon systems. Thus, the Star Wars program, or codename Excalibur, was born. President Reagan was briefed on the alien threat. And he mentioned that in many of his speeches. You can Google it. It's common knowledge that he was scared. He was one of the few presidents who was actually briefed on everything. Why do I know this? Because the person that briefed him was one of our instructors in the intelligence operations course that I went through. Okay? So, and during classified settings, he told us this. And he was scared to death of the alien threat. So he said, we gotta plan this. We gotta put something in space to warn us or defend Earth. And lo and behold, the Strategic Defense Initiative was born. The system could be used to shoot down launched missiles from Earth and incoming objects from space. One of the scientists, unfortunately he died, that worked on the SDI, spoke at a scientific convention years ago. And although it was a bland speech about math and all these boring things, he did mention that one of the purposes of the SDI was to protect Earth from ground-based or Soviets launched missiles and anything coming in from space. Now, they didn't, I think most of the people in the audience didn't really think much of that at the time, but later on, some people thought, wow, that means we got aliens coming in and going to attack Earth? So it did both. These platforms in space can shoot down anything coming from Earth, and it can turn around and shoot anything coming back. That's the Surveyor, and we're going to talk about the Surveyor program. That's the Surveyor. Surveyor 3 landed on the moon on April 17, 1967. Surveyor 3 photographed the moon surface, which Surveyor's missions, all of the Surveyor missions, was to plan a landing, a manned landing on the moon. Surveyor 3 contained a classified device inside the lander. On November 20th, 1969, Apollo 12 astronaut Pete Conrad extracted the classified device from Surveyor 3. Now, if you look at this, the landing of the Apollo 12 And where surveyor landed, bingo, they're walking distance. Just a quick walkabout over there and get it and bring it back. Years later, P. Conner related the device that was extracted from the surveyor was a secret camera attached to a voice recorder. Now you can Google this again. This is what he says. Now he doesn't know what's in it. He didn't look at any of the pictures. He didn't even know if it worked. In fact, he said, I'm not even sure if it functioned. But scientists had some sort of knowledge that they wanted to make sure if there were entities living on the moon, that we would know something about them. So they sent a surveyor with a secret camera that would be photographing the surroundings and a voice recording, just in case, I guess, the ETs came over and tried to talk to the spacecraft. I don't know what the voice recorder would be for. Now, again, P. Conrad and I, excuse me, I spoke to him. He frequented the laboratory down in Austin where I worked. He didn't know if it ever worked, but he knew his mission was to go over there, take it out, put it in the spacecraft, and bring it back to Earth. Now, did it pick up any alien languages? I don't know that. Project Dorian. The unclassified part of this project was manned orbiting laboratory, which was eventually the space station. The classified portion of the project pertained to placing classified satellites in orbit and photographing both ground objects and space-based objects. The system used on the satellite was called Turnaround. Turnaround was a satellite system. It's orbiting Earth, taking pictures, monitoring everything coming out of Earth, and it could also be turned around by ground signals and photograph what's coming in from space. Turnaround system. That was classified. Why? Why do we have a turnaround system? Well, maybe got aliens coming in, or unidentified aircrafts, or maybe even meteors or asteroids. I mean, that could be also a mission. I'm not denying that. The ground controllers could turn it around and target either Earth or space. NASA deep space probes and space surveillance. The 18th Space Surveillance Squadron, which was at one time the United States Air Force, is now part of the United States Space Force and is responsible for tracking all satellites and all space debris. Everything that's in space orbit, they're tracking. The 18th monitors NASA series remote tracking satellites, codenamed Starband, placed in orbit between Mars, Jupiter, and between Saturn and Neptune. Yes, you heard me right. And again, we can thank Gary McKinnon for that. We have objects in deep space orbit around Neptune. Why? Why do we have them so far out? Well, NASA will never admit they have them, and the NSA won't admit they have them. But a person did speak about it at a news conference. He said, if we had them, they're probably here to protect Earth from asteroids or comets. Take it for what you think. Are they for that purpose? Or are they for protecting Earth from alien threat? Over the past years, there have been a number of intelligence reports to suggest that NASA, or NSA, may have any number of what are termed deep space probes, some reaching beyond Earth's orbit. There's two speeches made by former NASA and one by a former Air Force colonel, a retired Air Force colonel, I should say, who speak about this. But they speak in the terms of what if. What if we have the capability of launching a spacecraft from Earth into deep space orbit, circling or orbiting around Neptune or Uranus or Jupiter? What if? What if we had this? What if we had these things? Now, you read it between the lines, you'd say, and they probably know what they're talking about. Gary McKinnon, as I mentioned before, the Scottish Systems computer hacker. He hacked into the U.S. secure link Sobel star system. The information revealed highly classified material relating to NASA and NSA deep space systems. We also have an NSA whistleblower, not the one I'm talking about, but somebody else. And this deep space, NSA whistleblower talks about the same thing, about things that are in space. Let's talk about the space program real quick. I'm running out of time. Known deep space satellites. Stingray was launched by Space Shuttle STS-51J. You can look, Google this. Something was launched, supposedly a classified defense. Sandal Slipper, Amber Light, Cocker Peak. They were all launched by space shuttles. Twinkle Eyes, Kite Tangle, and Phantom 1. We have Phantom 1 and Phantom 2 were launched years before, placed in orbit. Lancer King launched in 1982 on STS-4 for a deep space mission. Little else is known about this. It's mentioned in McKinnon stuff, but it doesn't say anything else about whether it was successful or not. Lancer 2, again, this is supposed to be in the asteroid belt and monitoring satellites, threats coming from asteroids or comets. We have Coral Rim 1 and 2, Donner Kite, that was launched in 1990. We'll quickly talk about the United States Space Force. The mission of the Space Force to monitor space, protect space, okay? They took over everything the Air Force was doing to protect space. We already talked about what President Reagan did. U.S. Space Force operates and controls and directs all satellites. Now we've talked about the NRO already. And let me close by reading some statements made by former military personnel. General Curtis LeMay, 1968. Curtis LeMay was the commander of the Strategic Air Command. He was a decorated fighter pilot during World War II. He says, "We have eyes in space." This is 1968. "We have eyes in space. We can see into space to protect the Earth." This is actual quote. You can look it up. General David Jones, who was Chief of Staff of the United States Air Force in 1975, made this statement. "We have assets in space. These assets can detect any and all possible attacks on Earth from space." And then we got General Larry D. Welch, 1986. "We have all space covered." Now, why would these generals make these statements? Because we have space covered. They have space covered. Kind of ran out of time here, but real quickly about defense contractors. One way to hide information is through the defense contractors. We have Lockheed, Raytheon, Boeing Advanced Systems, Northrop Grumman, L.S. Harris, General Atomics, all working on the secret space program. They get the information and they can hide it. Finally, talk about Voyager 1 and Voyager 2. Voyager 1 was launched, 2 were launched in 1987. Their primary mission was to explore Earth, explore the solar system. But their secret mission, they had a camera in, which is now turned off, that was supposed to photograph certain parts of our solar system. That's classified. You can find a TRW manual, and TRW is the contractor that built these two. You can find a manual that talks about the secret camera. It's out there. It's going into the deep space. Ben Rich, we already have the means to travel among the stars, but these technologies are locked up in black projects, and it would be an act of God to ever get them out and benefit humanity. He made that statement at UCLA. We have technology to take ET home. We now have We know how to travel to the stars. Back. I appreciate your attention. I hope you enjoyed the presentation, and we'll see you tonight at the panel. Thank you.